The Korean War, often called the Forgotten Conflict, holds a significant place in history as one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War era. Despite its immense impact, both politically and socially, it has faded into the shadows of public consciousness, overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War. Today, we'll explore the origins, events, and lasting consequences of the Korean War, a conflict that reshaped the global political landscape. In the aftermath of World War II, Korea was a country left in limbo. For decades, it had been under Japanese colonial rule, but Japan's defeat in 1945 changed everything. The Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces controlling the south. This division was supposed to be temporary, but as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew, Korea became a microcosm of their ideological struggle: communism versus democracy. The North, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, established a communist government with the support of the Soviet Union and China. Meanwhile, the South, led by Syngman Rhee, aligned itself with the United States and embraced a more capitalist democratic system. The divide wasn't just political, it was deeply rooted in competing ideologies, ambitions, and visions for Korea's future. By 1949, the situation had become a powder keg, with both sides claiming to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. On June 25, 1950, the powder keg exploded. North Korean forces, heavily armed and supported by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise invasion into South Korea. Their goal was clear: to reunify Korea under communist rule. Within days, the North Korean People's Army had pushed deep into the south, capturing the capital, Seoul, and sending South Korean and American forces into a hasty retreat. The United Nations, spearheaded by the United States, quickly condemned the invasion. For the first time in its history, the UN authorized a military response, forming a coalition of 16 countries to aid South Korea. The United States provided the bulk of the troops, with General Douglas MacArthur at the helm of the UN forces. By late summer, the situation looked dire for the South. North Korean forces had cornered UN troops in a small area around Pusan, known as the Pusan Perimeter. But this setback marked a turning point. Reinforcements, supplies, and strategic airstrikes allowed the UN forces to stabilize the front lines and plan a counteroffensive. In September 1950, MacArthur orchestrated a bold and risky amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city near Seoul. The operation was a stunning success, catching the North Koreans off guard and cutting off their supply lines. Within weeks, UN forces recaptured Seoul and pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. But instead of stopping there, MacArthur decided to press further, aiming to reunify Korea under a non-communist government. UN forces advanced deep into North Korea, nearing the Chinese border. This move alarmed China, which saw the presence of foreign troops so close to its territory as an existential threat. In late 1950, China entered the war in force. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, referred to as the People's Volunteer Army, crossed the Yalu River and launched a massive counteroffensive. The sheer numbers and tenacity of the Chinese forces overwhelmed the UN troops, forcing a retreat back into South Korea. Seoul changed hands once again, highlighting the ferocity and fluidity of the conflict. By early 1951, the war had devolved into a brutal stalemate near the original dividing line at the 38th parallel. Trenches, barbed wire, and relentless artillery barrages made the battlefield eerily similar to World War I. The fighting was intense, with high casualties on both sides, but little territorial gain. Amid the military deadlock, diplomatic efforts to end the war began. The United States, China, North Korea, and South Korea entered into negotiations at Panmunjom, a village near the front lines. However, these talks were slow and contentious. Issues like the repatriation of prisoners of war and the exact boundary line were fiercely debated, prolonging the conflict. On the home front, the Korean War was testing the resolve of the nations involved. In the United States, the war was initially seen as a necessary stand against communism, but as the years dragged on, public support waned. For Korea, the war was a devastating tragedy. Families were torn apart, cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of civilians were killed, injured, or displaced. The scars of this war ran deep, leaving an indelible mark on the Korean people. One of the most controversial figures of the war was General MacArthur. His aggressive strategy and insistence on expanding the conflict into China brought him into direct conflict with President Harry Truman. MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's more cautious approach, advocating for the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. This insubordination led to his dismissal in April 1951, a decision that sparked a fierce debate back home, but underscored the importance of civilian control over the military. By 1953, after 3 years of grueling combat and little territorial change, both sides were exhausted. A ceasefire agreement was finally reached on July 27, 1953. The Korean Armistice Agreement established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a heavily fortified border that still exists today. Technically, the war never ended, as no formal peace treaty was signed. The 38th parallel remained the dividing line, leaving Korea split into two countries. The Korean War left a profound legacy. For the United States, it marked the beginning of a more interventionist foreign policy, as it committed itself to containing communism worldwide. For China, the war solidified its position as a major player on the global stage and boosted the legitimacy of Mao Zedong's government. For the Soviet Union, it demonstrated the limits of its influence, as it had to rely on proxy wars rather than direct confrontation with the United States. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Korea itself. The North became an isolated, authoritarian state under the Kim dynasty, with a focus on militarization and self-reliance. The South, after years of political turmoil, eventually transformed into a thriving democracy and economic powerhouse. The stark contrast between the two Koreas is a direct consequence of the war, highlighting the divergent paths they took after the armistice. Despite its importance, the Korean War has often been overshadowed in popular memory. In the United States, it's sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War, partly because it occurred between the more iconic conflicts of World War II and Vietnam. Yet for those who fought in it, the Korean War was anything but forgettable. It was a brutal, harrowing experience that tested the limits of endurance and bravery. Today, the Korean Peninsula remains one of the most volatile regions in the world. The DMZ is a constant reminder of the unfinished business of the Korean War, and tensions between the North and South continue to flare up. The war's legacy is still felt in every aspect of life on the peninsula, from the political rhetoric to the divided families yearning for reunification. As we reflect on the Korean War, it's crucial to remember the human cost of this forgotten conflict. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and entire cities were wiped out. The war reshaped the lives of countless individuals and families, leaving behind stories of sacrifice, resilience, and heartbreak. It also serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of global rivalries and the dangers of ideological extremism. The Korean War wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a clash of visions for the future of a nation. And while the guns fell silent in 1953, the echoes of that conflict still reverberate today. In the end, the Korean War is more than just a chapter in the history books. It's a story of perseverance, division, and the enduring hope for peace. By revisiting this often overlooked conflict, we can gain a deeper understanding of the challenges and sacrifices that shape the modern world. Let us not forget the lessons of the Korean War, nor the people who lived through its trials.